where you need trust within the organization as a whole if people are going to pass information, if they're going to work with each other, and the like. And that's what we call social capital. And the bond of trust between the top and the bottom is often broken. Yeah, in flat organizations, you've got to have trust in order to get cooperation. In outsourcing, you need these trust relations. And so that's one of the critical issues, is how to build that trust between, especially the bond between government and citizens. And this is why I thought, the Medellin case was interesting, because it's one of the few cases I know of where a municipal government was actually successful in building a greater degree of trust in itself by doing certain things that were very visible, to make citizens realize that the government actually can do something positive for them. All right. So social capital, I'm going to skip this part because I want to get into this issue of delegation, which is obviously, as bureaucrats, this is really important, to all of you, all right? How much to delegate? Principal agent doesn't really tell you very much about this. So you have to delegate. No set of rules are going to be appropriate in all circumstances, and therefore, if you run an organization through micromanagement, in which you are specifying all of the different contingencies and what you have to do under this circumstance and that circumstance, it's not going to be an efficient organization. People have to be allowed to use their judgment, right? And again, expertise usually resides at the low levels of the organization and not at the top. And so you want people to take advantage of that expertise, and you want them to take advantage of local knowledge, right? So these are all reasons, again, why we have to delegate in government, in organizations, and the like. But can you trust the agents? Can you actually trust them with delegated authority? So Bob Klitgaard, who is one of the big experts on corruption, has this formula that corruption is equal to discretion minus accountability. That is to say, the more authority you delegate to your agents and the less accountability that exists in the system, the more corruption you're going to have. And so his recommendation is to increase both the level of accountability and to decrease the amount of discretion. So a classic case of that we have another case on this about the customs agents in Indonesia. So customs agencies in almost any country are one of the biggest sources of corruption, right? Because the agents have a lot of discretion. So all these containers are coming across the border, and the ship captain or whatever can say, okay, you lower my customs fee in return for a bribe, and we'll both be better off, right? And so how do you solve this problem of corruption? Well, Indonesia solved it in the 1960s by outsourcing the entire customs agency to a Swiss company in Singapore. So they basically took away all of the discretion from their own customs agent and gave it to a computerized, European firm sitting in a different country. So that's an extreme case of taking away.
How does that help? It just shifts from its agents to the company. Company, the same thing will happen.
No, because the Swiss agents are not. First of all, the Swiss agents are using a computerized system, and they're also Swiss, and it's really hard to bribe them.
They have all these banks, so they don't need to bother.
Yeah, that's right. So
in any case, it comes back to
they have all bigger things.
yeah, the Swiss are not as uncorruptible as. But in this case, it worked pretty well. That the level of bribery went down, very, very substantially. But this is a really extreme solution, right? Is to eliminate all discretion whatsoever. And in fact, there was so much pressure on the part of the customs agents that lost their jobs that they finally had to restore them to their positions, and then the level of corruption went back up. All right. So, but this is this puzzle that in many countries, including this one of the things that drives people crazy is that there are too many rules, right? You go to an office to get a license or something, and the bureaucrat says, no, I'm sorry, can't do it, or I'm sorry, this office is not open on Monday, or we're closing at 5 o'clock and it's now 5:01, so I'm not going to give you your license, right? So there are all these detailed rules, and the bureaucrats are just following the rules, and this leads to people being incredibly frustrated and angry, with the public service. And yet, here's Mr. Klitgaard, this big expert on corruption, saying, well, but you need to have these rules, because if you don't have these strict rules, your local bureaucrat is going to say, okay, well, you're my friend, it's now 5:05, and I'm going to give you that service, but I don't like this person over here, and so I'm sorry that the office is closed for you, but it's open for you, right? So this is the big problem, is that discretion can be used well or it can be used badly, and the issue is, how do you know when to delegate that kind of authority? When can you safely delegate it? And so this was and how do you basically build trust? So this is my way of thinking through this conundrum of what's the appropriate level of authority to delegate in an organization. So this axis measures bureaucratic autonomy. So this is a bureaucracy that has no autonomy whatsoever. It's only expected to follow rules issued by the principal. And over here, they've got complete autonomy. They can do whatever they want. So in my view, in a kind of stylized way, I sort of think that there's a inverted U, and that you don't want zero autonomy and you don't want 100% autonomy. You want some degree of autonomy in the middle, that people have discretion, especially in implementation. They don't have too many rules that they have to follow, but in the end, they have to be responsive to the principal. They don't set the rules themselves. If you set the rules yourself, you're acting like the Japanese army before World War II, where you're basically launching a war. The prime minister doesn't want the war, but the army says, well, we're going to launch the war anyhow. That's not a good, thing. So the Japanese army is over here, but the bureaucrat that closes exactly at 5 o'clock is over here. And so, there's some optimal amount of autonomy that's somewhere in the middle, but where do you draw the peak of this curve? Where does that exist? And I think this is related to state capacity. So in this diagram, we have 4 different countries with 4 different levels of capacity. This is a low capacity country, this is a high capacity country, and then you've got one that's kind of in the middle, all right? And in my view, the amount of authority that's safe to delegate depends on the capacity of the bureaucracy. It's safer to delegate more authority to a high capacity bureaucracy than it is to a low capacity bureaucracy. So in the Indonesian customs case, most of the customs agents didn't even have a high school education. A lot of them had been foot soldiers in the War of Independence, so they were being rewarded for their loyalty, but they were not highly trained professionals. On the other hand, if you think about organizations that have a lot of autonomy, in the United States, they would be the Federal Reserve, the military, or at least the command of the military, the Centers for Disease Control, Food and Drug Administration. These are agencies that are staffed by PhD economists or by medical professionals or people that have spent their entire life, gaining a lot of expertise. And in that circumstance, you're more likely to trust them with more discretion than in a low capacity situation. And that's why I think that I put different countries in different places. You may object to the placement of India, but this is, lots of rules and low discretion, and this is, high autonomy and large discretion, and then this is a capacity. Actually, India, as I think about it, actually the circle should probably be larger, because if you take you as a group, the IAS, it's a very high capacity part of the bureaucracy. But unfortunately in India, it's not the whole bureaucracy. And so if you look at Indian government as a whole, the bulk of it is not trained, to your level. And therefore, in those parts of the government, you would want actually more constraint and less discretion. On the other hand, if you're a managing director of a state agency that's making a lot of important decisions on infrastructure investment, negotiating, you're going to be delegated a fair amount of discretion. And so this is, I think, the secret that you have to get right is that the amount of delegation has to be appropriate to the capacity of the agency that is implementing. This is true even in a high-capacity country like the United States. So the staff of the Federal Reserve Bank in Washington is probably one of the most expert agencies anywhere in the world. Everybody there has a PhD in economics. The TSA, the Transportation Security Agency that was created after September 11th, has got all of these relatively poorly educated workers at every single airport. They're very annoying because they always want to make you take off your shoes, and they're given these orders that no bottle with more than 4 ounces of fluid can go through the detector. And so, this grandmother, has got this water bottle, and the agent says, no, you have to, you may be a dangerous terrorist, and we're going to, the rule says that you can't take this water bottle through, and no exceptions to the rule, right? And that's kind of an example of the way that you can organize bureaucracies. In Israel, they've got a very serious terrorism problem, and they don't handle it by using low-skilled workers operating under these bureaucratic rules. What they do is they train people to interrogate individuals coming on the airplanes at a very sophisticated level. So there was an incident quite a few years ago now where an Irish girl was trying to get on a El Al airliner. She had an Arab boyfriend, and the boyfriend had actually put a bomb in her hand luggage, right? And so the agent, before she got on the plane, started quizzing her, saying, why are you going to Israel? Oh, it's my boyfriend. I want to visit his family on the West Bank. Well, when's the last time you talked to him? And it raised these suspicions in the minds of the interrogator that her story didn't really check out, right? And so then they searched her luggage, and sure enough, they found the bomb. And so this is, these are two alternative ways of managing airport security. You can use very low-skilled workers, subject them to these standard operating procedures, very rigid rules, or you can give a lot of discretion to a highly trained professional to try to figure out who's dangerous and who's not. I think in the United States, we had to pick the low skill route for a number of reasons. First of all, just given our identity politics, if you pull out all the Middle Easterners with beards trying to get on airlines and let the white grandmothers get on without being interrogated, somebody's going to object to that. They're going to say, you're singling out, a certain class or race of people, and that's not acceptable. And so we kind of have to operate by these very impartial rules. But it's also kind of a choice. I mean, Americans don't like bureaucrats, and they don't like highly trained bureaucrats, and we don't want to spend a lot of money training very skillful interrogators. And so we end up with these kind of high school educated people that tell you you can't take this water bottle on the plane with you because you're violating a rule, right? So I think these are issues that all governments have to deal with. I think that as you develop, you get richer, you get more educated people working in your government. The degree of discretion should increase, but for political reasons, a lot of times it doesn't. Why doesn't it? Because even in the best bureaucracy, if you delegate discretion, somebody eventually is going to screw up. And the moment they screw up, this becomes an invitation for the political class to then use that as a way of getting at their opponents. And this, unfortunately, is, I think, a tendency in all democracies to use poor performance as an excuse for going after your political enemies. And that's why it's very difficult for public sector agencies to take necessary risks, because the moment you delegate authority to take a risk to somebody and the risk doesn't pan out, then it becomes political fodder for some politician to criticize. All right, so that's, yeah.
One question,
topic that you didn't directly speak of, but this whole, there's a transparency movement that's been
Yes.
growing over the last 20 years. And what are your thoughts on that? Is there something, I mean, opacity is obviously not good. Is there something that's like too much transparency?
Yeah, so, right. So that's a great example, actually, because the transparency movement comes out of the principal agent framework, right? The idea is we're going to monitor the performance of our public officials very, very closely, and we're going to hold them accountable, right? So in most countries, that's a great thing, because in most countries, public officials are not accountable because nobody knows what the hell they're doing, right? So this is a good thing. I think that there should be more transparency in government. However, you can have a little bit too much transparency in certain circumstances. So, so one case of this is in deliberation, right? All agencies have to deliberate. And sometimes when you deliberate, you throw out ideas that, if taken out of context, may not sound so good, like, well, why don't we just, nuke them or something? I mean, something, I don't know what a good example of that is, but people throw out ideas that don't work out, and then they discuss it further, and then they say, okay, that's not such a great idea. If you have complete transparency, if all of this is on YouTube or, on evening TV, somebody is going to use that statement against you, and then it really puts a damper on deliberation. So in California, in the United States, we have several federal statutes that say in an agency, if you are deliberating with more than 2 agency people and 2 people from outside of the agency, it has to be considered a public meeting. It has to be open to media scrutiny, and it also has to be balanced for partisan representation. So you can't just meet with Democrats, or you can't just meet with the Republicans. You have to have partisan balance in this. And as a result, our multi-member commissions like the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Federal Trade Commission, the commissioners do not deliberate with each other. And if 2 commissioners get together for lunch, it's considered a public meeting, and they have to allow the press to follow what they're doing and put it on the public record. It's a crazy system, So I think that, yes, you can have too much transparency because, like any negotiation, so for example, I think that democratic decision-making depends on compromise. So you get all these different interests, and they say, okay, you get a little bit here, you get a little bit there. If you subject that to complete transparent scrutiny, you'll never reach the deal, because somebody will object to giving up X in order to get Y, right? They'll second guess, continually. And that's why we have this fast track authority in trade negotiations where the actual negotiation is secret. The trade negotiator can make all these trade-offs, in talking to the foreign partners, and then you present the entire package. That can be scrutinized, but the actual process by which you got there has to be shielded, with a certain degree of privacy. And so I think this is kind of at the frontier of democratic theory, because in terms of values, if you're a politician, you get up and say, yeah, I think there's too much transparency, you're not going to get anywhere. People immediately say, well, what are you trying to hide? But in fact, I think a certain amount of privacy is actually necessary for deliberation and for good decision making.
This is what has been happening after RTI Act. After our RTI Act.
Yeah.
Right to Transparency, Right to Information Act. Our notings are now out under the Act. So because of that, what happens, if anybody objects in writing to any policy decisions, the individual is simply thrown out. Simply thrown out. And everybody else then comes online. What is happening? So notings are very carefully written nowadays. And this must be the problem all over.
Yeah, and I think
deliberation takes place.
there's so we've got a problem in several respects where, because there's increased transparency, there's also increased distrust of government, that people are able to see. I mean, we were talking about this yesterday evening, but like with police shootings in the United States, to the extent that anyone can actually measure this, the level has probably gone down over the last 20 years. But because there's so many cell phone cameras, a lot of these are now caught on video, and then you put it up on YouTube, and then everybody rightly gets outraged, and they think that this is a big trend towards more police violence, when in fact what it is just more transparency about the way that police are operating. So, you know, I think that in general this has led to the decreasing authority that governments have, because when you actually look at the sausage factory and how these sausages are being made, you say, yuck, you know, this is not, this doesn't actually look so good.